Rishi Sunak's wife owns, it doesn't sound like much, 0.94% of Infosys, which sounds to you and me like, what's 0.94% amongst friends?
Pocket change, Peter.
Pocket changes, but it's also 39 million shares. Infosys have actually just been put on two major government contracts, one from the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the other to do with the NHS. And these contracts are worth over £750 million. Shouldn't we be declaring these things? If this was a company, if you were on the board of a company, and probably even you and I were working for a company, these are the kind of things we would have to declare. Not as live conflict of interests per se, but as potential conflicts of interest, so they can be managed better. And I think it says something about how we manage these things in Britain that this doesn't even have to be declared.
Peter, hello.
Hello, Ollie.
How are you?
I'm very good, thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Welcome to Joe Towers, the new Joe Towers, compared to the old one. I think, did we have you in the last one? I can't remember. You knew where we were, but maybe you didn't come. Anyway, here we are. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Before we get into the meat and drink of this, why don't you tell our viewers who you are and what you do?
My name is Peter Geoghegan. I'm an investigative journalist. I wrote the book Democracy for Sale, Dark Money and Dirty Politics, and I now run a Substack called Democracy for Sale.
And on that Substack, in the last week, you've had I would describe it as a banging story, an interesting story, about Infosys. Why don't you tell us that story?
Yeah, so if your viewers don't know, Infosys they're a very big company. They're a massive they're based in Bangalore IT firm. They do work all over the world, 300,000 employees. And the founder just also happens to be Rishi Sunak's father-in-law. And Rishi Sunak's wife owns, doesn't sound like much, 0.94% of Infosys, which sounds to you and me like, what's 0.94% amongst friends?
Pocket change, Peter.
Pocket changes, but it's also 39 million shares. And at the moment, they're worth about £600 billion, give or take a little bit. So it gives you some size, some idea about £600 million. It gives you some idea of the size of Infosys, and they're an interesting company. They've increasingly started doing much more work, public work in Britain. They do a lot of public work around the world. They're one of these companies. When you're talking about these big, huge kind of IT companies, the big thing they're often looking for is government contracts. Because government contracts are good, they're dependable, they're reliable, they often pay well. And when you get more government contracts, your share price goes up, so everybody wins. And if you're a shareholder, like Rishi Sunak's wife, that's good news. Aside, she actually received over £13 million last year in dividends from Infosys. So, there's good money in it. And I realised, and I was doing some digging, and I noticed that Infosys have actually just been put on two major government contracts, one from the FCA, the Financial Conduct Authority, and the other to do with the NHS. And between them, these contracts are worth over £750 million. And these are what are called framework agreements. So what had happened is Infosys would have been approved to be on them. There's no guarantee of any contracts, nothing have been signed. But the chances are you'll be ending up with some pretty big public contracts down the line. And it's kind of a piece. Infosys have been getting more and more British government contracts in the last few years. They've had about 65 million all told in the last 10 years, but about 47 million of those since 2020 when Rishi Sunak became the Chancellor. And, I'm not suggesting they're getting contracts just because Rishi Sunak is the Chancellor, but I think it's an interesting thing to note. And that was my story. I was looking into this and kind of just seeing where the money's coming from for this kind of thing.
It's really important, isn't it, Peter, to note nothing illegal, as far as we're aware anyway, is going on here.
No, nothing illegal. No, these are, in some ways you could say, these are standard tendering processes. This is how public procurement works. And the interesting thing, I think, is actually if you're looking at the progression of the company has gone from getting one-off contracts or being on smaller frameworks. These are by far the biggest frameworks they've ever been on. And I think in some ways, that's the interesting thing. And it does reflect that this company wants to do more business in the UK. And why shouldn't they? They're a big global company. But of course, given the nature of it, given the nature of the connections between Rishi Sunak and this company, it is interesting. And actually, the ethics advisor in Parliament ruled last year that Rishi Sunak doesn't have to declare his wife's interest in Infosys in the register of interests. And we all know it's there, but I think there's something about that where you go, well, actually, shouldn't we be declaring these things? If this was a company, if you were on the board of a company, and probably even you and I were working for a company, these are the kind of things we would have to declare. Not as live conflict of interests per se, but as potential conflicts of interest, so they can be managed better. And I think it says something about how we manage these things in Britain that this doesn't even have to be declared.
There's an interesting thing, right? Because something that Rishi Sunak will often say, essentially that his funds are in a blind trust, so it can't possibly sort of contaminate his political decision making. I know that there was a bit of a scandal, a bit of a hoo-ha around, again, his wife and a childcare company off the back of the childcare announcement that the Conservative government made. And Is it fair to sort of to say, right, Rishi Sunak, his wife, man and wife, their financial interests are actually connected to each other, so she is deserving of a level of scrutiny as the Prime Minister's wife? Or should we be looking at it as she's an individual person? I sort of get a little bit sensitive about it, whether or not there's sort of like a, I don't want to say it's like sexist to be like, well, she is his wife, so her financial interests are relevant, or we should be treating them and sort of breaking them off from one another. I don't know sort of what your stance is on that.
I think it's an interesting. I think it is. It's not as simple. I think it's this is an individual in their own right. Their wealth is known. It is documented. Similarly, Rishi Sunak, it's worth mentioning, he is the richest person ever to be the Prime Minister, and he has substantial wealth. And you're saying some of it's in a trust, and he earns quite a lot of dividends off that too. And pays a much lower level of tax on that because of their dividends than a PAYE worker. So there is exceptions there too. But I think in the context of, and I think especially in the context where Britain is these days, and the roles in which we've seen kind of around, especially around public procurement and public contracting, I think there's a need for a much higher level of perception and transparency around these things. And that's why I do make that point about like Rishi Sunak not having to declare these interests. And I think it's, their interests aren't conjoined, they are separate people, but they are in the same household. And it's, it's the family actually. In many ways, Infosys is actually Rishi Sunak's father-in-law, it's his mother-in-law, it's his relatives. It is in some ways a family business. They own about 3% of the company now, but that's worth about 2.5 billion. These are big numbers of money. They sound small, but they're big numbers. And in that context, I think there's a need to have a higher level of transparency. I think that we've had traditionally. And I think the contracting, some of the stuff we've seen around PPE and contracting scandals, I said, we're not saying anything illegal has happened here, but the opaqueness of how these decisions are made, the opaqueness of relations between people. We have unfortunately got quite a bad track record of this in the last few years, and I think that does make it important to place some scrutiny on what's happening.
Well, you tried to FOI the government, didn't you, about a meeting between Infosys and a government minister. How did you get on with that? Yeah,
so I noticed that Dominic Johnson, Lord Johnson, who just also happened to have been Jacob Rees-Mogg's former business partner and had been a considerable donor to the Conservative Party before being put in the House of Lords and made a government minister. It's incredible how many hats people can wear to be so successful at so many things. And he'd had a meeting with Infosys back in April, and I'd asked the government for simple things like minutes of this meeting and a readout, and I was told, frankly, no. They said, there's an interest in transparency, which we understand, but in this case, it's confidential information between a company, etc., etc. And unfortunately, that's the case a lot of the time when you ask this government for information. That's happening more and more as well. You're seeing it's harder and harder to get information that I think has a genuine public interest.
It's almost something illicit probably isn't going on, quite possibly isn't going on. But when you shut down avenues of inquiry, when you do become less transparent, it can almost provoke that conspiracism, right? And actually it's a danger for governments that if they do become less transparent, open themselves up to less scrutiny, people that otherwise would, if there was a valid explanation or, literally just the minutes of the meeting, which, knowing what minutes of meetings look like, probably actually wouldn't be that revelatory anyway. You go, well, there they are. But the fact that they won't release them, it means that people who are perhaps a little bit more minded to the conspiratorial all of a sudden go, well, Peter, what is happening in that meeting?
I think this is the problem. I think this government's got itself into this, it's a problem where they're just so resistant to anything that looks like transparency on so many levels. I think it's a real constant problem. Minutes. FOI, we've never seen it's the lowest level of FOI rates we've ever seen in terms of response rates, and that has a knock-on effect. As you say, people are less trusting of government. They don't believe things the government say to them. They believe the government's not telling them the truth. And if there was a bit more transparency into these processes, some people will always think that, but you wouldn't have the kind of blanket assumption. And the problem as well is that we've had a culture where the government has said one thing and actually the opposite's been proved. And we saw that with the PPE contracting stories. Yep. And I was on that story very early from kind of March, April 2020. And I couldn't believe it, to some of the things Michelle Moan said recently, Doug Barman and the Conservative Party. I spent years and the government was just saying to me over and over again, there's nothing to see here, there's nothing to see here. And you get the same response from the Cabinet Office every time you went and said, but this person's a Conservative donor and they're getting this contract. Nothing to see here, it's an emergency, nothing to see here. And now we know about the text message between ministers and civil servants and donors. We know about all of this stuff now, which in many ways, and I must say it's actually much worse than I would have thought it was. That's what was going on. I would never have thought that level. I would never have thought there would have been a VIP lane for political donors. No, I just, of course not. You wouldn't do that. And I think that's part of it too. The kind of sense in which, instead of holding our hands up and going, okay, look, we've really got this wrong. We need to step back. We need to be more transparent. We've actually had the exact opposite. I did a story recently about the fact that Rishi Sunak hasn't appointed what's called an anti-corruption champion. So basically, it sounds like a kind of made-up job. We had Westminster's supposed to have an anti-corruption champion, brought in about 20 years ago. The last sitting anti-corruption champion was a guy called John Penrose, who was a Tory MP. He left when Boris Johnson refused to... Boris Johnson broke the ministerial code over Partygate and refused to do an investigation because the only person who could sign off an investigation into a breach of the ministerial code is ... the Prime Minister. So that's how ethics works. And Rishi Sunak said, look, I want integrity. And his minister said, we're going to appoint a new anti-corruption champion. 15 months later, since he said that, there's nothing. There's nobody. Nothing has happened. And I actually sent again, because I'm the way I am, I wrote a story about this and I sent in an FOI request saying, can I please have details of people you've spoken to? And I was told, no, I couldn't possibly give you that information because it would prejudice an ongoing process. And I'm like, what ongoing process? You refuse to say what you're doing.
There's a process, but we can't tell you
anything about this process.
Yeah.
And I think it's someone like me who will ask those questions. It's incredibly frustrating. And there's a party going, well, why can't you just do, that's not a difficult thing to do, for example. You just appoint an anti-corruption champion. It's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference, but you've done it. And so the resistance to even doing simple things makes you very worried, especially with an election coming up where the Conservative Party is raising records amount of funding, is trying to raise as much money as it possibly can. They've changed the electoral laws so they can spend more money than ever before. And we know the connection between donors and public procurement. That's a real issue that we're not seeing. Then we're not seeing the government. We have to ask the question: how much does the government actually believe in transparency and in these sort of things?
And it can have real world consequences, right? When you, I don't know, it might seem abstract to people, but if you look at something like the decreasing rate of the MMR vaccine, right, where you are going to be reliant on government health messaging in order to boost that back up again. If you've got a ton of people that no longer trust the government because they've been proven to lie about things, sometimes things as trivial as, whether or not they were getting pissed in Downing Street on a Friday night. Okay, so when it comes down to something as serious as the vaccination of children, they go, why on earth would I trust these people when they've lied to me about something as minor as that? So it does have real world consequences. I want to come on to the point about elections and the money in British politics momentarily, but to just put the case to you for the Sunaks, their defenders may say, yes, Rishi Sunak and Akshat Murthy are very, very well off. They may well be the richest couple to ever inhabit Downing Street, but they pay their taxes. They pay what they have to in this country, what they owe, and as a result, they are just... This is capitalism's divine bounty. It's enriching them and it's enriching our society. How do you answer that defense?
I think, the tax side of it is fascinating, just as an aside before I give you the full answer. We had Akshat Murthy was a non-dom, we know that. So in which case you basically pay £30,000 a year and that's it, and then you can pay your taxes elsewhere. She now claims that she pays her full taxes in the UK. Rishi Sunak belatedly released his tax statement, which, if you look at it, was really interesting because it's not like a tax. It's not like I've often put in self-assessment tax returns. They never look like Rishi. They don't look like Rishi Sunak's. Not just in terms of the numbers.
One day they look like that, Peter.
But also, it wasn't actually what you send into HMRC. It was prepared by an accountant. It was prepared for publication rather than which was interesting. And if you look at it, most of the money he made came from dividends. So he paid an effective tax rate of 22%. So there is that issue. Again, frankly, this is a government that has decided time and again not to tax wealth. We have a very low level, not just a corporation tax, but our capital gains tax is really, really low. And so you're talking about 20%. So you can make money on shares sales that you tax, whereas unearned income is taxed really low in the UK, but earned income is taxed really high, 40%, 45%. And so if you're wealthy, you can actually pay way less tax as a proportion of your income than or a portion of the funds that you have if you're not. So, and that is a system that successive governments, but be it previous Labour governments too, have created. But more generally, I think there is, I think I can see there's a squeamishness, I think, in Britain about asking about the private lives of politicians. That's not always a bad thing. I think that's not always a bad thing. But I think we do have to ask about like the representativeness of our democracy in terms of wealth and the people who make decisions. Look at not just the Sunaks, look at landlords in Parliament. A much, much greater proportion of parliamentarians are landlords than the general population. Most people aren't landlords. A lot of people, a significant proportion of MPs are landlords. And you've an issue then when they're making legislation, because they have a direct financial interest in this. And more generally as well, our rules are just not good enough. And I think that's why it's important for people like me to ask these questions, or at least put this in the public domain. And as I say, I'm not saying anything illegal has gone on here. I'm just putting it in the public domain. Because under the Commons rules, you only have to declare a shareholding if it's more than £70,000. Or 15% of the company. £70,000 is quite a lot of money, and and you can have multiple shareholdings in different companies worth as huge sums. Potentially as much as you want actually, but as long as it's not worth more than £70,000, it doesn't have to be disclosed. Again, people are making decisions or are voting on laws that are potentially significant to their material interests. So there is at least a potential of the problem is we don't even know if there's a conflict of interest because it's not declared. And I think that's my big point with this.
Yeah. And I guess one of the recurring themes, which let's talk about now in relation to that fundraising drive by the Conservative Party, is that actually in Britain, particularly when you compare it to America, let's say, where the funds involved in order to influence politics quite often are in the hundreds of millions of dollars, right? In Britain, influence is relatively cheap. £50,000 can get you cabinet minister access, basically, at a Tory fundraiser. And I know, absolutely rightly, £50,000, £70,000 are sums you were just mentioning, right, as shareholdings. That is a lot of money. It's a lot of money for most people. But in terms of buying influence in a political system, it's value for money, isn't it?
Well, it's remarkable. £50,000 will not just get you access to a cabinet minister at a fundraiser. For £50,000 a year, if you give it to the Conservative Party tomorrow, and actually what you can do is actually you can give it to a shell company. You don't even have to give it yourself. So we can set up a shell company on the internet now. It takes us 5 minutes, and we can give it the money. And that gets you membership of a thing called the Leaders Group of Conservative Donors. So that invites you over the course of a year to go to at least four meetings with the Prime Minister and leading cabinet ministers, at which you get to chat to them freely. No minutes are taken, no notes are taken. We don't actually know who's there anymore. The Tory party used to publish this information because there had been a bit of a scandal during David Cameron's time, remember him, over this. Then they actually mysteriously stopped and scrubbed the records. Luckily, I do still have the records that were on the internet. You'd be surprised to find out. So I can say who was there up until about 2019. But they're gone now. So and exactly that, the access is incredibly cheap. And when I first started doing this work a few years ago, I thought, look, compared to America, these aren't as big a problems in America. In America, it runs on money. And then I actually started to realise, no, it's in some ways a bigger problem because there's actually much less money. And it's much cheaper, so you can buy access much more easily. And most people don't contribute to political parties. In America, there is a bit of a culture of philanthropic giving, even to politics. So there's there's still mega donors for sure who pollute the space. There's also smaller donors too. In Britain, we actually don't really have that. We just have these mega donors, both between them, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems and the Tories, between the three of them, and actually individually each, more than 50% of their income comes from less than 10% of their donors for each of those parties. So you can see the real influence you can have. We had the case with Robert Jenrick, the then housing minister, and Richard Desmond, where Richard Desmond sat beside Robert Jenrick at a Tory fundraiser, and Robert Jenrick subsequently changed a planning decision to do with a big development in the Isle of Dogs. Again, they all say there was nothing untoward with that, but the problem, I think, for a lot of people is the issue that what happened. That's concerning, and even if you say nothing happened that was untoward, it's still concerning. But also that's how access works. You go to a fundraiser for a political party, and this is how decisions are taken. And I think that's the thing where we have small amount. There's a lot of chasing of money into politics, but at the same time, actually, we're seeing more and more money as well. We have never seen actually as much money, but the Conservative Party raised more than £30 million since the start of last year. Labour about 2025. It's going to ramp up more. The spending limits have now been increased. The government brought in changes. I wrote about it on my Substack before the end of last year, pretty much at the dead of night, through statutory instruments, no need for legislation, which have massively increased the amount of money that you can spend at the election, but also the amount of money you can give anonymously. So it's now much more easy to give more money anonymously. So you won't know who's giving the money and you won't know anything about it at all. And as we can tell from what we know about how money affects politics and how small amounts of money have affected political decisions, that's really concerning.
I think one of the really interesting things for me as well is this growing trend of the donors actually jumping ship from the Tories and moving over to the Labour Party, which I think for me is a really clear example of they think that the Labour Party is going to win the next election. So they're donating to the Labour Party. And so you just have to go, oh, so what are they buying? What do you think it is that why are they making that decision? It's clearly not political loyalty. It's clearly not because they were diehard Conservatives and now something about Keir Starmer's agenda appeals to a diehard. Well, possibly, but it's probably not the case. It's more access to power, isn't it? And they're hedging their bets that they think that's going to be the next Prime Minister, that's going to be the next Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I want to be in the nest alongside them.
Well, this is it. I was actually really struck. The Sunday Times brought out at the weekend the tax list, the top 100 taxpayers. And because I'm sad, I was just kind of running my eye through it. And so many of the names were so familiar to me as political donors. I was like, wow, there's so many. And I think that to me is really interesting. What are the chances? In the same way I did an investigation a few years ago, I worked on an investigation that was about Conservative donors in the House of Lords. And every single Conservative donor, bar about one, I think, who become party treasurer, once they gave £3 million, they got a seat in the House of Lords. And you're like, the chances of that many donors getting seats in the House of Lords were by chance, basically, randomly, in the same way that the seats in the House of Lords are supposed to be allocated, was the same as winning the lottery every week for 13 weeks in a row.
Not bad odds.
Not bad, yeah, exactly. Would you take them? You're going to go down to the shop every day?
Yeah.
And that's it. There's a sense, and I think because we have had, and we've now seen it from what happened with the pandemic and COVID contracting. I think that really showed that relationship between donors and access and what can happen in a way that I think even for someone like me in the past was like, well, we don't really, what's exactly happening here. We don't really know. Similar things happened in the Blair administration, etc. But I think there's the problem of money in politics, and I can see Labour now are focusing more and more on getting in big donors, high value donors to try and outgun the Conservatives. I can see that. The big concern is that we know that the legislation doesn't work. Well, the new legislation was brought in, the Elections Act, actually makes the situation worse. It's not hard to fix. All the things you need to do or fix are already there. They've all been recommended by select committees, by the Electoral Commission, by other parliamentary bodies. It could be done. It's just who wants to do it.
What a stirring place to leave things. Peter Geoghegan, thank you so much for coming in to talk to us. Where can people find your work? Where's the best place to get it?
The best place to find me these days is actually on my Substack, the Democracy for Sale Substack. You can sign up there.
Perfect, Peter. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for having me.